There are places on this planet that reject our interference. In the early 1900s, Cypress Creek was the front line of industry. Logging camps sprung up overnight, taming the perimeter of the bayou, pulling out massive, ancient cypress trees. The men who came to conquer this place thought it was just wood and water. But industry didn't account for the swamp's infinite patience. Modern cartographers can't map this area. The channels shift with the seasons. Deceptive bends lead only to dead ends, and the atmosphere itself feels heavy and ancient. It is a sprawling, uncharted maze of dead water, rotting wood, and a constant, humid stillness. Stained by centuries of decaying leaves, the water here is as black as pitch, a mirror reflecting a sky that is almost always shrouded in oppressive fog. The Cypress Creek Bayou belongs only to the few locals who know its deceptive bends, and they know one name above all others: the Blackwater King. He isn't just a myth, he's a consequence. Biologists tell us that reptiles never truly stop growing if they live long enough. The logic applies seamlessly to the king. He has outlived the loggers, the survey crews, and generations of hunters. This isn't just a large animal. It's a prehistoric giant asserting its dominance in a landscape that has forgotten the rules of human logic. He has mastered an evolutionary advantage that is nothing short of terrifying. He is highly intelligent, and he doesn't just wait in ambush. He lures. The old-timers living in the surrounding parishes whisper about still, foggy nights when the silence of the bayou is suddenly broken by a quiet, rhythmic whining, a sound mimicking a distressed young animal. It is a siren luring the curious, the compassionate, or the greedy souls into his territory. Since the 1930s, when the last logging operation was abandoned, consumed by the muck and moss, more than 30 boats have vanished here without a trace. Search parties, when they risked venturing this deep, would find the aluminum hulls days later, crushed in ways that defied physics, parallel, serrated gouges etched into the metal. The context here is everything. These weren't just attacks, they were statements of territory. But the passengers? Not a trace. You cannot outlive the Blackwater King. You just wait for him to find you. Mark Thorne didn't believe in ghosts, and he certainly didn't believe in bayou monsters. He was a seasoned wildlife photographer, a man who had tracked silverback gorillas in Rwanda and faced down polar bears in Svalbard. The Blackwater King was his newest obsession. Armed with high-end 4K cameras, underwater microphones, and a reinforced neon orange kayak, he intended to prove that the legend was nothing more than an overblown, whiskey-fueled superstition. He launched his kayak at dawn. For the first few miles, the bayou was alive with the sounds of herons and cicadas. But as Mark pushed deeper into the restricted zone of Cypress Creek, the environment shifted. The ancient cypress trees grew closer together, their branches weaving into a tight canopy that completely blocked out the sun. The hanging Spanish moss looked like decaying cobwebs. The temperature dropped. The birdsong abruptly stopped. It was replaced by a heavy, unnatural stillness. Mark kept paddling, focused on his GPS coordinates, entirely unaware that the labyrinth was shifting behind him. The swamp wasn't just a location. It was a living, breathing entity, and the trap was being carefully set. It happened in a fraction of a second. The water here was too dark to read the depth. Mark was navigating a narrow channel when his kayak slammed into a massive, submerged snag. But this wasn't a piece of driftwood. The object shifted. There was a sickening, echoing crunch of splitting fiberglass. The water rushed in immediately, freezing cold beneath the warm surface layer. Panic, raw and primal, finally set in. The kayak was torn open like a tin can, rapidly taking on water. Mark had only seconds. He grabbed his waterproof Pelican case containing his main camera and blindly scrambled over the sinking plastic, throwing himself onto the only dry land for miles. It wasn't even a real island. It was a miserable, unstable mound of tangled roots, dead vines, and sticky, foul-smelling mud, barely the size of a dining table. Mark lay there, gasping for air, coated in black slime, watching his kayak slip beneath the dark surface and disappear entirely. He was safe. For now. But as he sat there shivering, watching the shadows stretch and the sun steadily sink below the tree line, a horrifying realization washed over him. He was completely isolated, and the bayou was waking up. What Mark didn't fully grasp in that moment is that alligators are flawless aquatic hunters. They possess thousands of sensory pores on their jaws, allowing them to detect the microscopic vibrations of a struggling victim from miles away. And Mark's desperate thrashing had just broadcast a dinner bell across the entire swamp. As absolute darkness fell, the swamp temperature plummeted, and a thick, blinding fog rolled over the water. That's when the Blackwater King began his psychological game. First, the smell hit him, a repulsive, heavy stench of rotting meat and musk that coated the back of Mark's throat. Then came the sound. It wasn't a roar or a splash. It was infrasound, a low-frequency, guttural vibration that humans feel more than they hear. The water in Mark's canteen began to violently ripple. The rotting wood beneath him vibrated. He could feel the hum rattling the bones in his chest cavity. It was the voice of a prehistoric giant asserting its dominance. Trembling, Mark clicked on his tactical flashlight and swept the beam across the water. He froze. Through the drifting fog, breaking the black surface, were eyes. Dozens of pairs of pale, glowing red eyes flared up in the darkness. They surrounded his tiny island in a perfect perimeter, floating completely motionless. But they didn't advance. The king was in no rush. He was highly intelligent, and he was testing his prisoner. Out of the darkness, a colossal, armored head silently bumped the edge of the island. The impact nearly threw Mark into the water. The beast was deliberately ramming the root system, trying to dislodge the mud. The rotting wood began to groan and splinter under the massive weight. Inch by inch, Mark's tiny sanctuary was sinking into the black water. With the first pale gray rays of dawn cutting through the oppressive fog, Mark Thorne realized his agonizing paralysis had to end. The night had been an eternity of mental torture, listening to the Blackwater King circling just inches below the surface, feeling the low-frequency hum of its infrasound rattling the root ball beneath him. He was a broken man, but his brokenness had given way to a terrifying clarity. Staying meant dying. The tiny island of tangled roots and mud, barely larger than a dining table, was visibly sinking under his collective weight and the constant battering of the Leviathan below. He had perhaps 2, maybe 3 hours before the black water swallowed him whole. About 100 yards away, through a sickening stretch of murky shallows that Mark knew was the king's active domain, stood his salvation. The skeletal remains of an abandoned wooden hunting shack built on heavy stilts. It was high ground. It was safety. But the price to reach it was staggering. He would have to plunge into the freezing mud, wade waist-deep through the very environment the ancient predator had perfected for killing. Mark looked down at his Pelican case containing his life's work. The high-end cameras, the priceless 4K footage of the swamp's secrets. It was his career, his passion. But in that frozen moment of decision, he realized the king didn't care about his artistry. He abandoned everything. Mark took a breath that shuddered with pure animal terror, slid off the sinking roots, and plunged into the thick, sucking mud. The shock was immediate. The water here was freezing, contrasting sharply with the warm, humid air, a hidden chill that stained the back of his throat with the heavy stench of sulfur. Every step was a battle. The mud was waist-high and foul, filled with sharp, submerged branches and unseen debris that tore at his legs. He didn't just wade, he fought against the vacuum of the bayou. Mark didn't look back. He forced his eyes on the dilapidated wooden ladder hanging from the shack's porch. 30 yards, 50 yards. The mud was relentless. Suddenly, the water behind him erupted with a violent displacement, a roar of sound and movement that was too large to ignore. He felt the displacement push against his legs. He didn't scream. His breath had been stolen. He was a small, fleeing creature in a monstrous trap. Mark scrambled, propelling his broken body forward through the slime, fueled only by pure, desperate adrenaline. He hit the wooden ladder and scrambled upward, collapsing onto the rotting floorboards just a split second before a collision the size of a car hood slammed against the heavy stilts directly beneath him, vibrating the entire structure and snapping its car-sized jaws in the empty air where his legs had been. Mark Thorne survived. He was rescued 2 days later by a search and rescue helicopter, suffering from severe hypothermia, shock, and a silence so profound that it took him weeks to speak a single word. He never again picked up a camera. His obsession, his ambition, and a large part of his soul remained buried in the mud of Cypress Creek. He refused to discuss the events of that night, as if naming the monster would somehow summon it again. But the story of the Blackwater King didn't end with Mark's rescue. A month later, after the swamp had returned to its deceptive stillness, a brave recovery team managed to retrieve the remains of Mark's equipment. They found his expensive Pelican case, heavily battered and covered in deep, parallel, serrated gouges that no standard Alligator could make. The case was structurally compromised, but the memory card inside was, somehow, intact. What you are looking at isn't found footage. It's chilling physical proof. Mark Thorne spent his entire career analyzing the bite force and predatory tactics of apex predators, but he had never seen anything like this. Look closely at the deep, terrifying parallel claw gouges and bite marks carved into the rugged, heavy-duty polymer. The hardshell structure was crushed. The case was destroyed. This isn't a faulty render. It's terrifying physical evidence. The context here is everything. Mark Thorne, a man who documented apex predators, had never seen bite force that could destroy heavy-duty polymer and leave gouges this wide. It confirmed every whisper about the king. The Blackwater King is still out there, deep in the Cypress Creek bayou. And as long as people dismiss the old-timers' warnings as mere superstitions, he will never go hungry. The swamps have teeth. He just waits for the next intruder to find them.